Hi there, welcome to Games Over Coffee Consulting. My name is Devon. This is where indie developers submit their games and I try to give my feedback on their game design. Me and Sean of Design Frame, where I talk more philosophically about the type of game that you're making and the story involved and stuff like that, while he dives deep into the mechanics of the game design. Today we're talking about Oil Pit. Oil Pit was made by the same developer that made Netherguild. If you don't remember Netherguild, this was the video about it here. This is a much more minimal type of game. This is nothing like that one. This is text-based, and this is inspired by a dark room. We're going to talk about a couple things today. Most of all, I want to talk about connection and mystery. One of the things that I think is the most important as a person who tries to help with game design is to understand what the developer wants, right? Because if I don't know what they want, then there's no reason why my critique matters at all, right? So this developer said something about mystery in their game. They really wanted to hit home on mystery. Oil Pit is super mysterious. It has to do with a post-apocalyptic like tribe, it feels like, of people called like oil engineers and hunter somethings. Without getting too spoilery, you're the one who gives them orders, basically. As you play the game, you find out more about the world. You found out more about the people around you. You found out more about who you are, stuff like that. Right off the bat, what did I do when I played this game? Well, I played it and it was interesting for a little bit, and then I didn't really care about the mystery, and that was it. Now, obviously, I played much more of the game than I would have if I just found this randomly, but that's the point here, right? Is that if I were to have found this game randomly, I probably wouldn't have played as much as I did. So we're here to find out why. I have Lego hair. That's what I'm calling this. So what is mystery? Okay, mystery is lack of information, basically. If I told you Dr. Jones was killed and nobody knows who did it, that is objectively mysterious. You don't know all the details there, but do you care? Are you connected at all? And probably not. You don't know who Dr. Jones is. I don't know who Dr. Jones is. I just made this up. You know, there's nothing connecting you to the event, right? Nothing that I told you has mattered yet, even though it is inherently mysterious. So how do we get connected then? How do we connect with the mystery? Well, if we were to look at really mysterious game like The Witness, for example, okay, The Witness is very mysterious from the outset. You begin in a very long white hallway, and then you come out into like this really interesting looking garden. Does it beckon to be explored? Kinda, but the only reason why you want to explore it is because there's a skill involved. The game has to do with puzzles. It is a game after all. So as you're playing the game, it's really mysterious, and I feel like you're connected with the mystery because you have a goal. Your goal is to complete as many puzzles as you can, unlocking each gating mechanic as you go forward. But if this game were to have no puzzles and it was just a mysterious island, some could say that could be interesting in like a Proteus kind of way, right? Where you just kind of wander the island, but you wouldn't really be connected to the mystery in any way other than just being immersed in it. Now, if you're the type of person that just likes to immerse themselves in experiences without having any kind of skill involved, then, well, you're a walking simulator kind of person and you're my type of person. But for the average user, that's not the average person who plays games, right? A lot of people who play games like the skill part of the game, right? They like to be involved somehow with the game itself. They want to somehow get some feedback from their input. So what that means is that when you're playing something like The Witness, you can get connected to the mystery because you're doing something, because you're working towards something. You have a goal. And even if it's not an explicit goal, like even The Witness doesn't really have an explicit goal, the implicit goals are everywhere, right? You have panels that each have a completion state, and then you have more gating mechanics on top of that. So games have a lot of connection through this type of skill set, kind of this idea that you have a goal, and that because you have a goal and a skill set in the game, you are now attached to the game, and there's things that matter. There's stakes that are given to you. When you have mystery in other mediums, like movies, for example, in movies and books, you have characters, usually. You have characters that then go through the mystery, and you have this kind of empathy with them, right? You have an empathetic thread that you're sharing, and you can understand the mystery that they're going through because you're connected with the person. Now, games, not all games have characters in them, and I have a whole empathy thing about theory about empathy. You can check out my main channel if you're interested in my whole theories on empathy. But the idea here is that in games, when you're playing the game, you are directly connected to the actions that are happening. In a game, you don't need to empathize with anyone. You have direct connection with the game because you're providing some sort of input and it's giving you feedback, right? There's a direct correlation there. So because of that, you're the one who needs the stakes. You're the one who needs the goal. So with all that being said, does Oil Pit have a goal? I don't feel like it does. And that's kind of the issue that I was having with it. When I was playing the game, much of the game felt like it was just more lore building, and it felt like the game had already assumed that I care about the world. Now, I know that sounds a little harsh, but that is how you have to think about your art when you're making it for other people. If you intend for other people to play the game, or if you intend for other people to be attached to your stuff, then you have to make it with them in mind. That's kind of separate from what art is. Usually when you're making art, that's self-expression. But when you're making something for an audience, you really have to think about the communication here and about what you're trying to say to them. So why do they care about Oil Pit? And in my eyes, people don't care about anything in here because they don't have any goal associated. Now, there are a couple of things that might be implicit goals in here, but I wasn't really sure. And I think that's kind of the issue here. In Oil Pit, the first thing that you do, the very first thing that you do is you assign a kid a job. You come to this screen right here, and the screen has something to do with, it says, you know, there is a kid coming up and you have to assign him a job. Which one are you going to choose? And already there's some sort of risk involved, but you're not exactly connected to the risk just yet. But you're going to go ahead and, you know, see what happens because it's mysterious, it's interesting. Let's just go with it and see what happens. Once you do that a couple times, then you come to your first decision. And this decision is random. We're going to look at one just for the sake of an example. You come across someone who has somehow been preserved, a human, presumably. You can try to wake them up or you can just leave them be. Is there a reason to do either? I don't know yet. So let's say we wake them up. Okay, well, once we wake them up, then we have questions that we can ask them. And we're still getting into this point of why. I'm still not exactly sure why we care about any of this. So, you know, we can ask for more information. But after doing this an amount of times, we start to figure out that there's some information that we've learned from the person, but we're not exactly sure what that means to our experience yet. So again, this is one of those events that assumes that the player already cares about the lore. So something that I'd like to see is some sort of implicit goal, right? Some sort of thing to guide the player in the direction that you want them to be. Now, Oil Pit does have an ending. In fact, I didn't even know that Oil Pit had an ending because it felt just like kind of randomness all the time. But Sean of Design Frame actually got to the end of the game and figured out what the game was about at that point. He actually had a goal that then we could use to continue the gameplay. But you don't know about that until you get to that point. And I never hit that point after playing the game, I want to say at least 15 times. So about implicit goals, I think one of the games that does it really well is this game's inspiration, which is A Dark Room. I've only ever played the web version, but I think there's also one on Steam that Sean has played. The one on Steam moves much more quickly. I'm going to talk about the web one. Even in the beginning of the web one, which is much slower, this game is an idle game, more or less, and it has implicit goals that are built in. There's nothing telling you to do anything, but there's a lot of things that you can do, and it's presented kind of as a puzzle almost. If you look at this opening screen, the name of the game is actually the first implicit goal. It says A Dark Room, and then it says Light Fire. With this whole screen right here, it forms a puzzle in the player's brain. It's a very, very simple puzzle, but it's one to get the player to understand, oh, I know what I need to do. I should light the fire. And so they light the fire, and then the dark room becomes either a warm room or a lit room, one of those, but the room warms up and it lights up and you start going, oh, right. And you start putting things together. And then there's another goal. The next goal is to feed the fire more wood. And then it's to get more wood. And then it's to increase your efficiency with that wood. And then it's to do more stuff like get hunters and then build a village. And there's all kinds of things that branch off from here, but they're all goals that are implicitly stated from the beginning.
Hey all, Sean here for a real quick interruption. Devon mentioned how the web and Steam versions were different, and yes, they are quite different, including no longer being an idle game. I'm showing the Steam version right now. Devon mentioned that A Dark Room establishes an implicit survival goal, which certainly was correct. Now, A Dark Room takes it a step further. We begin with an ominous sound and an intriguing story. The goal is clear, survive, but there's additional context, and the voices telling us to survive also adds an element of mystery, which Devon also talked about earlier. There's also a ragged stranger that collapses in our room, which reinforces our survival goal, but also now we're concerned and wondering who she is. And you could even argue that becomes a sub-goal. Once she's taken care of, her mood changes over time, which reinforces the mystery of our circumstances. Then the voices speak of a compass, which gives us a goal and motivation, and also reinforces our strange circumstances yet again. In this case, the mysterious voices from the beginning of the game. You get the point. These additional elements establish goals, frame our actions, drive us in a direction from its mysteries, moving on.
What this goal thing does is that it allows the player to get directly connected with the game at the mechanical level. Now, story games are just some of my favorite games ever, right? I love narrative games. And that being said, I know that Oil Pit is a bit more narrative than it is mechanical, but still having a goal, I think, is essential, or at least a skill set is essential to directly connecting the player to the narrative that you're playing. If Oil Pit did have implicit goals, or maybe even explicit goals of some kind, I think it would be more like Reigns. Reigns is this other kind of game where it's a kind of like a swipe left, swipe right type of game, where all you do is you're doing the same thing that you do in Oil Pit, which is you just make decisions over and over and over, except in this one, you're a king and your goal is very explicit. It's to live the longest. And so while you're playing the game, you are constantly keeping all of these little levels and you're trying to keep them in balance, because if you ever run out of one of them, then you're done for, right? So the whole idea is to keep surviving and keep making good enough decisions in order to stabilize your kingdom. And if you do that in Oil Pit, there's a little bit more randomness involved in Oil Pit. And because there's also an ending, not everything is geared towards survival. It's less about that and more about, I think, unlocking stuff. I'm not exactly sure. Actually, Sean will go into that on the next part of this video. Whenever you have a goal in your game, it shapes the player's experience and it basically tells the player what to do. In a game like Pac-Man, for example, when you eat a dot and it disappears, that tells you, I need to eat all the dots. When you're playing Tetris and you clear a line, that tells you, oh, I need to clear more lines, right? These are things that drive the player's gameplay forward. And so even if you have a narrative-based game, something that's based on the lore, you have to connect them, I think, at the mechanical level, or at least at the skill set level, somehow build with them, inform them what they should be doing or what they should be going toward, and then build your narrative off of that. So that is what I have to say. What?
I did not say anything.
Why haven't you spoken ever? That is what I have to say about everything. Let's move on to Sean. Take this away, Sean. Take it away. Cut.
There are a few things that prevent me from engaging in the world and game of Oil Pit. As Devon explained, I don't feel like there's a goal, and most of the events are luck-based and not meaningful choices. I think most of these issues boil down to context. The player is missing information and context throughout their journey. Let's work through an example and a few possible solutions. I believe the example that best demonstrates the potential behind Oil Pit is the flare above the dunes from the Illusion Beast event. We see a flare far above the dunes against the dark skies. Do we investigate or ignore it? First of all, is there a reason I shouldn't at least go investigate it and see what's going on? Given the information presented to me, the answer is no. Therefore, the ignore option isn't a meaningful option or choice. However, this is only a minor concern, so let's move on. We send hunter guards to investigate. They reach a crater in which a group of 4 unfamiliar people of one class huddle together near the bottom. For our purposes, we'll assume they're clerks. The clerks notice us and wave for help. This is where the event turns into pure randomness. If we send our hunter guards to recover them, there's a chance that they're real and we gain a reward. But there's also a chance that it's an illusion beast who grabs 3 hunter guards and eats them. This is pure luck because nothing changes except for the outcome. We always spot a flare, followed by a group of 4 unfamiliar clerks at the bottom of a crater. The rest is luck. There's no other context that can help us make our decision. There's no information that roots the choice in careful preparation, knowledge gathering, observation, logical deduction, or pattern recognition. It's all luck. So, what does preparation, observation, and deduction potentially look like here? Let's find out by asking some questions. We walk over a dune to see the 4 clerks in the below crater. Can they not get out of the crater by themselves? Are there any signs in the environment that tell us how they became trapped? Are there any other environmental details related to the illusion beast? Are there other signs that the clerks are illusions? Can we talk to them and ask questions so we can deduce whether they're real or fake? These are all reasonable inquiries in order to evaluate the situation, but we can take it a step further. Because while it's extremely important for players to have sufficient context and information, we should still consider the gameplay. In other words, if the event description provides sufficient context, clues, or information, but it becomes too obvious whether or not the clerks are illusions, then there's still no meaningful choice because the player doesn't invest any thought or effort into it. On the other hand, if there's not enough information, then again, there's no meaningful choice in addition to a frustrating and luck-based experience. So a possible solution is to limit the offload of information to the player so that it's not too much, but also not too little. The event should not outright give us the direct answer, but it should also not rely on outcome randomness. Sounds simple enough, right? But we also have to think about what happens when the player sees the same event again and again. Or in other words, we need variety. Let's pretend that the Illusion Beast event adds an extra detail hinting to the player that the Illusion Beast lurks in the crater. The player notices the detail and correctly deduces that something is wrong, so they avoid the Illusion Beast. But the next time the player comes across the event, they notice the same detail and leave again. Without changing up the details, the event would quickly become predictable and tedious. After just one encounter, the player already learned how to read and interpret the environment and context. After one encounter, that event already turns into an obvious event with no meaningful choice from the lack of variety. After the puzzle is solved the first time, the game is over. So let's carefully handle information and variety. Let's say the first time we encounter the event, the description indicates 1 or maybe 2 important details that we can reasonably interpret and translate into action. The next time we encounter the event, the situation is slightly different with different important details. Now the player has to consistently engage with the game's writing in order to think about the situation and make a decision. Hopefully you can see how context and information is starting to form more meaningful situations that we can interact with through context, observation, deduction, and even pattern recognition. From here, we can build out the gameplay even further. For example, instead of relying on the description alone, we can start a conversation with the clerks, and we can choose what we ask them. Their answers may be reasonable or may not be, which provides the player with the information and context that they need. Then, the clerk's answers can change in future encounters with the event, so there's enough variety to sustain the gameplay loop. Do our hunter guards recognize some of the clerks or no? Do these clerks have enough supplies for this trip? How about the right gear for this trip? Where are the other civilizations in relation to ours? Did the clerks come from the correct direction? Are they wearing the correct garb from the region they're arriving from? Could these clerks be messengers sent to our civilization? Were we expecting messengers? If not, their message must be pretty important to break the normal schedule and flow of messages. So what's up with that? The player can learn and utilize information such as other civilizations, locations, scheduling, the message topic, etc. to determine if it would be at least reasonable to expect messenger clerks, or maybe we notice strange behavior and therefore walk away from the situation. Hi clerks, yeah, you know, we're the only civilization in the whole continent of Asia, so kinda weird, bro. Keep in mind, however, that some of these questions that we're asking the clerks might produce answers that are too obvious and uninteresting. It may be best to avoid those types of questions, or it may be possible to embrace the obvious answers. How? Provide the player with a list of questions that they can ask, but some of the questions would be better to ask in this kind of situation, while other questions might be kind of useless to ask in this situation. This isn't to say that it's easy to pull off, because if the player reasonably thinks one question would be useful but the game says no, then that causes frustration and a disconnect between the game and the player. The player should find it reasonable to deduce which questions should be asked in a given situation, and that's why it's important to understand what players are thinking while they're playtesting your game. Players come up with reasons for why they choose certain actions. Those reasons might not be good reasons, but it's still important to at least gather that data and to understand what the player feels. Okay, so we've talked about conveying the right amount of information, variety, and possibly allowing the player to ask questions depending on the situation. Let's take this event in another direction. Hey, come here. Remember earlier when I said instead of luck, we can focus on deduction and preparation. Much of what we've talked about focuses more on logical deduction than preparation. So how does preparation fit into this Illusion Beast event? We've already hinted at preparation in our previous example, so let's expand on it. We ask the clerks where they come from, they respond, from the north. Okay, so at this point, the game can tell the player, hey, these clerks aren't wearing northern outfits or gear. Boy, isn't that suspicious. Wink, wink. Or instead, the player themselves may be the one to recognize one of those discrepancies. Of course, the player themselves recognizing and acting on their own volition would be more satisfying. What this amounts to is having clues in the environment, description, options, etc. that are indeed clues, but the player may not know how to interpret those clues yet. We want the player to take note of something for later, so the clues and details become motivation for the player. We also have to be careful here, because if the clues or details are too subtle or don't appear as clues to the player, then the gameplay loop may lead to confusion instead. So back in town, the player can prepare. We know that the clerks are down in a crater, so the player may want to research the topic of craters and what those are potentially caused by, or if there are any creatures that typically inhabit craters. Luckily, Oil Pit already contains great potential to expand on this research idea through tomes. Our clerks help decipher these tomes that we find while out exploring. Perhaps these tomes contain certain information about certain topics that the player can research and learn. The player can then apply their newfound knowledge to the outside world, or in some way, better equip themselves to handle these massive threats. For example, maybe we learn that a certain creature tends to reside at the bottom of steep craters, and one potential sign of the creature is how unnaturally steep or shaped the crater is. Or maybe the sands act or move a certain way depending on nearby creatures that may be influencing it. During the event, the player noticed and took note of these smaller details, and now they can apply more meaning to those details, which feels like meaningful progress. There's a clear starting point in the mystery or knowledge, and an ending point. Or is there something we can throw into the crater to test if the clerks are real or not? Or maybe we learn what the limitations of the illusion beasts are, what they can and can't do, and what illusions they can create. For instance, when we see the flare in the sky, is that reasonable for an illusion? From my perspective, as someone who doesn't know anything about the creatures in this desolate place, a flare seems like an extremely long distance for an illusion. So maybe we learn the distance limitations of the illusion beast. And then, going back to deduction, let's say that we notice how the flare completely shuts off after a certain distance rather than flickers out. That would be a really cool detail to notice, then logically deduce that the crater clerks are likely illusions. We know that there are some kind of limitations to the illusion beasts. Then we deduce what appears to be a limitation in action. These kinds of details are fun to notice and solve. As long as it's not too obvious, of course, because then the player doesn't feel like they solved anything. Okay, so there is one important detail that I have yet to mention, and that is the lock and key mechanic called the Tome of Monstrous Wastes. In Oil Pit, there's an event where a traveler fights one of our hunter guards. There's a random chance that a bunch of hunter guards die, that I can't do anything about for some reason. Then we obtain the Tome of Monstrous Wastes. This tome is basically a key that unlocks many new avenues. We can now safely capture the spiral-horned creature, which is usually almost impossible to capture. We can also now safely drive off the drone wasps, instead of losing hunter guards. We can also use the monstrous knowledge to ensure the people in the Illusion Beast crater are real by throwing a small rock at them. Now, this sounds like what I was talking about just a minute ago, about methods by which we can test the Illusion Beast, including throwing some kind of object. This is why I emphasize that not every idea will work in practice. It's still important to brainstorm and prototype, but not everything will fit. In this case, if we throw a rock at the clerks, we immediately find out if they're real or fake. It's too obvious, and there's nothing to solve or deduce or involve the player in. So let's break down the new Monstrous Tome options into their basic building blocks. What the new Monstrous Tome comes down to is that it's an upgrade. The new options supersede the old options, because the new Monstrous Tome option is always the best option. And because we can only obtain this Monstrous Tome from a random event, whether or not we'll have these new Monstrous Tome options is random. Additionally, with these new Monstrous Tome options, we're not demonstrating learned knowledge. We're not making observations or paying attention to our surroundings. In fact, we can mostly ignore the text in this text-based game and just select the best option every time. And this basically has the same effect as what we discussed earlier, where we don't want events that are too obvious and have no variety, because the player is just going to ignore all of the text in the text-based game and click on the same option every single time. And maybe the Monstrous Tome could end up being a satisfying upgrade that allows us to skip these events. But we must build up to that kind of significant upgrade. It cannot randomly be given to the player. So how do we build up to a significant upgrade? See, that's where the scope of the game comes into play, because some potential ideas of tomes, upgrades, or even simply gathering information and knowledge may require bigger changes and expansions to the game's structure and systems. Is it worth expanding or significantly changing the game's scope? Or would it be better to limit the scope and work within tighter constraints? Often, limiting your scope is the best path forward, but it also depends on your design vision and goals. I was told that one of the inspirations for Oil Pit is a game called A Dark Room, so I decided to give it a try. It's a great minimalist resource management adventure game that I recommend checking out. For our purposes, A Dark Room is a great example of preparation. Let's separate A Dark Room into two gameplay loops. First, we have what I'll arbitrarily call the preparation gameplay loop. Then we have the exploration gameplay loop, where we embark to the outside world. In the preparation loop, we can prepare to bring exactly what we need for the length of journey we're about to embark on. Then we embark on our journey and explore the outside world in order to achieve our goal. Because the two gameplay loops are separated, the preparation can be informed by the exploration and vice versa. In other words, we know that our next trip is a short trip, so we'll prepare by bringing only a little food. Or maybe we're planning on exploring a nearby area, so we'll prepare by bringing more food and whatever other equipment like torches. Then we'll make sure to retreat back home before we starve. Or maybe we're planning on finding the location that our compass is pointing to, and we know that's much further away, so again, we bring the necessary food and equipment to survive. In Oil Pit, there aren't distinct gameplay loops like in A Dark Room. If we know that an illusion beast could be waiting for us in a crater, the only method by which we can prepare for it is to hope that we run across the Monstrous Tome, and then hope we don't lose all of our population and die in the process. The fact that every event is mixed together without distinct sections to the game severely limits how we can approach design. Now again, this limited scope and restriction isn't a bad thing. It's just a limit that we must adhere to. For example, my suggestions about noticing small details in the text descriptions are still valid within the limited scope of the game, like how a flare might suddenly disappear instead of flicker out. And then if we add some variety between our encounters of the same event, we're on our way to designing more meaningful choices through player observation and deductions. Now, there is one exception to Oil Pit's structure. At the end, we encounter a final event. Throughout the game, we're building up our army, taming useful beasts like the Spiral Horned, and obtaining equipment like the Heavy Laser until we encounter this final boss event. Earlier, I mentioned the idea of how the player can better equip themselves to handle massive threats. And while I don't think something like the Monstrous Tome works, I think the Heavy Laser does. Deep in some pit, the oil engineers discover an ancient military machine with a heavy laser weapon installed. We attempt to salvage the laser, and if successful, we now own a heavy laser. After some time, Oil Pit leads us to a big boss fight against a giant creature who crawls out from the pit. The heavy laser comes in handy here and can be used to deal massive damage. Then the final hour begins and the rest of our soldiers charge in. In my case, the soldiers all immediately died. In a future attempt though, I managed to get very lucky with boiling water, a heavy laser, a spiral horn, and a depth explorer. So as you can see, the specific pieces of preparation that work in Oil Pit are the ones that pay off in a final event after all of the mixed together random events. Basically, the first section of the game is all of the events, and the second section is the final boss payoff. These are two distinct sections that can inform each other, similar to how a dark room is separated into two distinct gameplay loops. So what this means is, anything that we obtain in the first section that pays off in the second section does pretty well in Oil Pit's design in terms of elements leading towards some goal or payoff. Except currently, the two distinct sections can't play off of each other. And here we come back to goals, because throughout the game, the player is not aware of the second section, of the final boss. This final boss appears to be the goal that we're building up to and working toward, but since the player isn't aware of it, then it's ultimately disconnected from the rest of the game. And without a goal, then it's difficult for the player to feel motivated. For example, going back to the heavy laser, when I first see the heavy laser in the mines, do I have a reason to obtain it? No, nothing outside of my possible personal intrinsic sense of defending my home. Once I obtain the heavy laser, do I know what the heavy laser is useful for? Not really. Sure, it's a big weapon, and big weapons are probably useful in some capacity in some applications, but I don't feel like I know enough about the world to understand why this weapon would be so important and how I can use it to my benefit. I'm just not excited to find and obtain the heavy laser, and I feel like I should be excited about it. Similarly, I had no idea why I had boiling water, or if I would get to deploy my spiral horn, and I was even surprised to see my depth explorer doing something in the final boss, since I thought the depth explorer was completely useless throughout the game, and I had no idea they were capable of the crazy feats they pulled off in the final boss. So overall, I'd say that Oil Pit lacks a goal and doesn't quite work within its limited structure, as it's missing satisfying choices, deduction, and variety within each event. However, I think the beginning framework is here and shows a lot of potential, and the world building is interesting and promising. It was mentioned to us that there have been player concerns about the death spiral that can occur in Oil Pit. What am I referring to? Once our hunter guards exceed our combined oil engineers and clerks, then you may lose a variable number of one class. This means that there's a chance our lack of hunter guards results in losing more hunter guards, which can snowball into a loss. Or if our group mood is low enough, our population spirals into an instant game over. Even though the death spiral can be uncommon, the reason why the death spiral is a problem is because it can produce a snowball effect or cascading failure. The problem isn't necessarily that there are punishments for group mood or population mismanagement. The problem is how those punishments are conveyed or presented to the player. The death spiral is presented to the player through separate container components, or what I'll just call boxes. In Oil Pit, each box contains either a new choice to make, or a new consequence, or otherwise some narrative beat. But when we stumble upon a death spiral, we witness multiple boxes pass by without any opportunities for choices or intervention. The player feels like they should be able to recover their population. So how do we fix the player feeling like the death spiral isn't fair? There may be presentation-related solutions, like combining the population losses into one box instead of several, although that is likely to be a bandage and players will feel like they still died from bad luck. I think the best solution would be to change the population loss so that hunter guards cannot die. This still allows the player to lose from reaching 0 clerks or 0 oil engineers, but now there's no possible snowball effect. It also makes sense that the hunter guards would be the last to die from starvation since they're the ones who hunt for the food in the first place. Okay, so lastly, I do want to go ahead and briefly mention a few more events and how they relate to context, luck, and choice. The Drone Wasp event also doesn't contain a choice because it makes it very clear that leaving them alone will make the situation worse. So, of course I'm going to deal with it now. The only reason to not deal with them is if we don't have enough hunter guards to deal with them, but if we don't have enough hunter guards to deal with them, then that likely means we don't have enough hunter guards to feed our people in the first place, which most likely results in a game over from population mismanagement. Additionally, the result of dealing with them now is luck-based with no mitigating factors. The traveling cult event also doesn't contain a meaningful choice because there's really no reason not to refuse their demands. Do you really think a leader, or whatever pseudo-king position we're in, will give in to a psychotic group making public demands who also are only somewhat numerous and untrained? A leader would never give in to their demands in a public setting in the first place, if at all possible, let alone a group who are severely disadvantaged by being outside the town walls, untrained, and not numerous. This is also one of the only events that require more than a few hunter guards to accomplish. I had 10 hunter guards and failed the event, which honestly left me quite confused. So I tried again with 14 hunter guards, which was the maximum that I could have when I encountered the cult, and I failed again. The failure resulted in a random loss of 3 clerks, which was already a game over. Then I tried again, but I lost all of my gained hunter guards by the time I reached the cult event. And then to add insult to injury, some random figure snuck in and bashed me for an instant game over. So as you can see, there are many different luck-based factors at play in reaching the cult event than executing on the cult event via the only reasonable choice. I don't think that leads to a satisfying player experience. It instead diminished my motivation to play the game. The small military pit event is another one that I can't justify narratively within the context that I have. I have very little reason to attempt the risk of navigating a minefield if my hunter guards and oil engineers just aren't prepared or equipped for it. Additionally, one possible fail state is that we accidentally set off a gravity bomb which kills the entire crew of 2 hunter guards and 2 oil engineers. If we're sending 1 oil engineer in to take the risk of grabbing the tome, why are the other 3 people within range of any potential blast radius? It breaks the suspension of disbelief. The last event that I'll mention is the skeleton concrete signpost. The oil engineers set up a skeleton in front of their workplace. We can either disallow it or let it be. Call me crazy, but I'm thinking, okay, it doesn't seem like a great idea to leave something morbid and a symbol of death in front of a dangerous work environment. I don't see how that wouldn't decrease morale. But if you choose disallow it and remove the skeleton, they instead lose morale and complain that it was a joke intended to boost morale. How was I supposed to know how the oil engineers viewed the situation? There's just no context here. Okay, so I'll instead let it be. I'm expecting it to be a playful joke among the oil engineers as the game told me. But instead, that oil engineer who complained that it was a joke completely gaslit me. The situation immediately escalates into most of the town turning the concrete skeleton into an idol. How did this happen? Where was the shift in group mood or actions that would result in this escalation? I feel like the skeleton event is a misleading choice between 2 extremes.
If you're a developer and you have a game that you need some help on, you can submit it to us. There is a link in the description, or you can go to gamesover.coffee. Or if you don't want like a big consultation, but you just want other people to play your game, there's a Discord that you can go to, the Games Over Coffee Discord, which there is a link also in the description. So thank you so much for watching. If you like this kind of stuff, please give us a like and a sub. If you really like this kind of game design talk, I have a main channel called Games Over Coffee where I talk about that kind of stuff a lot. Also, Sean has his own channel with far more subs. His channel's called Design Frame, and he talks about game design in just an incredible amount of detail. Give him a like and a follow. Yeah, we'll talk to you guys later. Thank you so much for watching.